I don't know if I can live up to that intro. But yeah, I've been working in Web3 for the last 6 years, and I'm more than ever convinced that this technology can really be a driver for positive change. And so I want to talk about that today. I think it's a very important time to talk about it because, I mean, many of you are probably reading the headlines. The reputation this industry has is not the greatest. Oftentimes, when you read about Web3 or crypto, it's in relation to some scam or exploit or, just generally to the casino mentality of the space. And I think that's unfortunate because that's definitely part of, an early technology and a lot of experimentation and, technology itself is neutral and there's always good ways to use this and bad ways to use it. But I want to share a few stories today on how this technology today is already used in the real world and having a real impact, and impact in places where the traditional financial systems have failed. And also taken up as an opportunity to maybe get you thinking a little bit. I'm convinced that longer term Web3 and sort of Web3 rails are going to underpin a lot more than they currently do, and I want to give you some ideas on how to think about that. So this is my favorite definition of Web3, and it's probably very different from the one that you're reading or used to. And again, you can think about this in the context of a lot of different problems and kind of things that people want to kind of coordinate. But to me, this was kind of what drew me into the space, sort of seeing, wow, there's the potential to having a technology that can really bring people, communities, organizations together and have them and provide them with an infrastructure for coordinating around some of the world's trickiest problems. Climate is definitely one of those problems and one that I'm personally very passionate about. And this is where the term ReFi, which was in the title, has kind of emerged and come from. And if you haven't heard that, that's no problem. I'll get into this in a little second. But wanted to just give a little bit more background on just who I am and Celo, so you have that as kind of context from where I'm coming from. So we started this 6 years ago. Celo mainnet went live 3 years ago. And since then, we've seen about 250 million transactions processed on the platform. There's roughly 30 million wallets. There's over 1,000 projects building on the platform. Some bigger ones that you may have heard of that are on multiple chains like Uniswap, Curve, DeFi projects, but then also a lot of grassroots projects. And I'll focus my talk today more on the grassroots stuff because I think that's really where some of the most amazing change is happening. And regenerative finance, this is a term that's become more and more popular, and I personally hope that the next wave of crypto adoption that we're seeing is going to be driven by ReFi. Maybe rewinding back a little bit, our current financial system is extractive, right? Growth comes at the expense often of our environment or of the communities, and regenerative economics provides some principles on how to actually have a financial system that has positive externalities, where when you're growing sort of, adoption, for example, of such financial system, you're preserving natural assets. So that's a concrete example. There's a bunch of different, other principles to think about it. And when we kind of thought about Celo, and we just started initially writing down some values and sort of things that we care about, those were aligning pretty well with these principles. And so we were like, oh, this is really interesting because a lot of the ideas that we wanted to kind of work on were things that Web3 kind of uniquely as a technology can enable, but until very recently have not been able to actually implement. So, we can take an example down here of natural capital-backed assets. I don't know who here has read Charles Eisenstein, a philosopher, great, from the States, one of my favorite philosophers. I don't know if I have many more, but I've written all his book. I've read all his books. He's written a book called Sacred Economics, which I highly recommend as sort of an entry to really kind of broadening thinking about how some of these regenerative principles can be applied. And what's interesting, that book predates Bitcoin. A lot of these ideas are not new in terms of the last 10 years, but they've existed and have circulated for a long time, but until now, the technology to implement them on a bigger scale hasn't existed. And I'll give some examples. I'll give some examples of that. So yeah, let's dive right in. I'll start with some more recent ones here. So this is something that just recently launched. Everybody here has probably heard of NFTs, and I personally don't necessarily understand why people pay hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for a picture of a monkey, but I can get behind buying an NFT if I'm a fan of, say, FC Barcelona, where each NFT is tied to plastic recovery, right? FC Barcelona realized that people are using a lot of plastic, whether it's plastic bottles or just people bringing stuff to the games, and they wanted to basically offset that footprint or start kind of basically compensating for that. And so they've partnered with a project called Plastics, which is built on Celo, and that is partnered with plastic recycling centers and is basically establishing a market price for plastic recovery and certificates that can be traded on the blockchain, but also provide the transparency so that when I'm paying for one certificate, I know that not over here someone else is maybe paying for the same, right? So it's really interesting for those of you familiar with carbon offsets, the voluntary carbon market. This is kind of like you can think of this as like a voluntary plastic offset. Really interesting because now the fans got to buy it's actually not pictures of the players, but cute little animals. But knew that with each NFT that they bought, there was also that kind of positive impact in the real world. One of the other pillars of regenerative economics was UBI. UBI is interesting, and I'm sure many of you here are familiar. But one of the challenges with UBI is how do you actually implement this at a large scale? This is one of the actually drivers that got us starting to work on Celo, because we were like, hey, what would it take to roll out a UBI program for an entire country, maybe the entire world? And what you quickly realize is that there's just a lack of infrastructure, primarily around identity, right? Identifying kind of is someone a real human, right? So they can't just claim 10 of those or 100. Or even government actors setting up, sort of fake profiles, which certainly we've seen in other contexts. But then also, it's tough to do this on a global level because, a lot of people are unbanked, a lot of people are underbanked, and so how do you, actually implement something where, say, you're streaming payments, you're giving someone $1.80 a day or something that lifts them out of extreme poverty, but with the current financial rails, that's unthinkable, right? I mean, most local kind of systems, the fees alone would eat up that cash transfer. And so Good Dollar here is interesting as one project where so far over 500,000 people around the world are basically have signed up, and they're in a mobile wallet, they're pressing a button, and they're basically claiming a payment on a daily basis. And by doing that, kind of really have created, in a privacy-conscious way, a global infrastructure for rolling out UBI programs, right? So you could imagine UNHCR, World Food Program, or some of the other big kind of, give directly big organizations that run UBI programs to just say, hey, why worry about ground operations? And that's a big part of their expense, right? If I can piggyback on this new infrastructure, and people have their wallets, they have the ability to cash out locally. In Kenya, for example, there's, I think, several partners now that have plugged into the Celo platform and are allowing people to cash in and cash out of M-Pesa, right, which is widely used, their mobile money. Speaking of Kenya, this is an interesting graph. Each of the dots is a business. This is more rural Kenya near Kilifi, a project called Grassroots Economics, which has existed for over 10 years. And they started basically, they invented community currencies, or among the teams that have done that at a bigger scale. Oh, hi there. Okay. What's interesting about them is they first started with paper vouchers. So this is kind of like if you're a small business owner, and you have a service that you offer, you can basically extend sort of a voucher, then trade it with other businesses in your community, and those vouchers start circulating and are effectively becoming a complementary to local money. Now, over the last 10 years, there's a lot of learnings, and their network has grown over 50,000 businesses, and they just recently, a few weeks ago, migrated onto Celo public network, in order to really accelerate the scale, right? I mean, this is from paper vouchers to private networks now to being on a public infrastructure to also take advantage of those community currencies interfacing with local currency and the cash in, cash out that exists. So really cool. And if you go to this website, you can click on the lines and it takes you to a transaction on the block explorer that shows you kind of basically the transaction between the two businesses. So those are some examples, but I wanted to also maybe frame this a bit more broadly in terms of sort of the trends and how to think about ReFi at a more sort of framework level for your business or for your organization. Or if you're a founder, if you're looking to get into the space, take it as an inspiration. First off, I think one of the big benefits that I think is not really contested is that blockchain brings a lot of transparency, and that is particularly helpful when you're thinking about leveraging that data set, right, for helping bootstrap credit score systems, something that Masa is doing, and this number is outdated. I think they've, at this point, minted over 300,000 domains, and there's this concept of a soul-bound token, which Vitalik popularized a few months ago, and it's really the beginning of a lot of activity around people and projects looking to bootstrap the equivalent of a credit score using on-chain data to then allow people to have access to credit more easily, which credit scores are not widely accessible or available in many markets. Wheelcoin is interesting. Actually, yeah, we talked right before my talk. It was like I biked here 20 kilometers, and actually, you probably earned a bunch of Wheelcoin if you have the app on your phone. So this is an app that's using the fact that there is a market price for voluntary carbon credits to basically reward individuals for climate positive behavior. In this case, this is tied to transportation. So if you're, instead of taking the car to your office, take the bike, right? That's a positive, it's positive climate actions. You're avoiding emissions, and so you get rewarded. You get a little bit of money to do that, and it's really interesting because it's kind of an app that just passively tracks, your mode of transportation through a bunch of integrations, and then people can cash out and use that cash to, or use the points they get, for example, to buy an e-bike or, buy a new bike or get discounts in sort of e-mobility friendly things, or just simply cash out and take the money. That's interesting because when I think about ReFi and going back to the earlier point about it being, or Web3 being a mass coordination tool, I think there's a big potential in the next 12 to 18 months for much more of this kind of consumer climate action, right? And I know a lot of people are eager to do that and go beyond just, recycling separating their trash. But what are the tools we have, right? We can try to elect the right government officials. We can, go out there and protest, but I actually think there's sort of a potential here for a bunch of new applications that give individuals much more control to take direct action. This is a small piece of what I think is going to be a much bigger ecosystem. Impact cards, similar idea. You basically have a way of, and this uses a new kind of dynamic NFT standard to track all the positive things you do and basically kind of get rewarded along the way. It's hard to talk about ReFi and not talk about voluntary carbon markets and tokenized carbon credits. I personally would say that's definitely been the thing that's drawn a lot of attention to ReFi as kind of a theme or meme and a helpful buzzword in my view. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And so I think the concept of tokenizing voluntary carbon credits is now well understood, and there's a bunch of players doing that. But what's interesting is to see that same concept being applied, as you saw earlier, to things like plastics, methane. There are several teams now working on tokenizing biodiversity and establishing sort of, in a way, markets for, in some cases, community public goods that can then be used, for example, to back a community currency. And by using the community currency, you're preserving those assets and getting utility out of things that otherwise, would have been just maybe like, oh yeah, it's nice to protect this habitat or this river or this forest, right? But what's the benefit? And here, there's now a benefit of actually having this tokenized representation and using these assets, for example, to provide utility in the context of currency reserves. The last one is, to me, so regenerative finance to me is broad. It not only includes where there's benefits to the planet, but also to the communities and even the individual. And so this is touching more on that. We saw Good Dollar earlier around basic income. Impact Market is another interesting project that very quickly, with very little capital, bootstrapped to a community of 50,000 people around the world that are receiving a daily social dividend to, in many cases, lift them out of extreme poverty. They're now starting to offer microcredit as well. Gainforest is interesting because it kind of extends sort of this pretty, if you think about some of these tokenized carbon credits, it's not too different than early stable coins where you take $1, put it in a bank account and issue a digital dollar, right? Here you take a kind of certificate for voluntary carbon credit that's certified by a registry like Vera, gold standard, and you put it on chain, and then you can have more efficient on-chain markets. But personally, what I think is much more interesting is thinking about where's climate finance going. And I don't know how many climate finance nerds are in the room, but if you follow COP and you look at, for example, Article 6.2 and some of the bilateral agreements that have been struck, that's super interesting because that's basically saying, hey, if you're a country in the global north, rather than buying on-chain offsets or offsets generally, right, just actually make reparation payments to countries in the global south, right, that have basically been in many ways is where a lot of the natural resources are that need to be protected, but also that have been paying the price, right, of climate change the most. And so it's interesting to think about this infrastructure to allow, for example, payments, right, to a community, say in the Congo, that's protecting the peatlands, and recognizing that that's something that benefits us in the global north. And right now there's no kind of value transfer for that. We're just kind of expecting that that's happening. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I think time is up here. So I touched briefly on microcredit, but what's interesting is that most parts of the world doesn't have access to credit, right? And there's new models emerging with the help of Web3, where either you're building a credit score right through your on-chain activity, which we saw with Massa, or you can also say, hey, there's maybe the ability to leverage other models. So this is a model where an employer, this is a company again in Kenya, Cinch, they actually said, okay, we're going to provide collateral and then allow all our employees to take loans out against that collateral. And you'd say, okay, that's an interesting model, but why do you need Web3? And the cool thing here is there's no contracts, no paperwork, right? They set that up, they put sort of that collateral up on chain in a smart contract, and the employees can take out loans against that. And it takes 5 seconds to get a stablecoin loan that they can cash out to M-Pesa, local mobile money. And that's a true game changer, right? I mean, compared to any other option in terms of getting access to credit. All of this, what makes me happy here too, and I was mentioning I lived the last 10 years in Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley still matters. That's a lot where the capital is. But increasingly, we're seeing, because these projects are, so kind of locally focused and also, able to tap into a lot of this kind of infrastructure that's globally available from day one, right? It's not like Stripe, which works in a couple different markets, right? And if your startup wants to use Stripe, then you better be in that market, right? But this is like, this infrastructure is global from day one, and it's open, it's permissionless. A lot of the on and off ramps are individual projects also that are just tying into this platform, right? So it's not something that I kind of really control, and that's really the power here, that it's possible to bootstrap this global ecosystem. That's my cue. Thank you very much. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Rene. I think, unfortunately, we only have time for one quick question. But again, you're probably going to stick around for a few minutes if people want to have a question.
I'll be here, yeah.
In terms of user experience, you obviously have a lot of experience in the user experience field. Having built a lot of products, what do you think the future of Web3 will look like from a consumer perspective? Will we actively know we're using Web3? Will we connect wallets? Or will it be basically like nobody really knows what HTTPS is and what other protocols are, and it's just in the background and we don't really know? What's your take on that?
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, it's happening already. I mean, many of the wallets that I see are, you don't really know that it's running on crypto rails. Account abstraction is sort of a big theme right now, where basically you don't even need to handle your seed phrase, but you can, for example, use, say you're using Google, right, to kind of make an automatic backup as you sign up for an account, right, or create a two-factor. So that's been a big trend, and I think, yeah, in a few years, those protocols will underpin a lot of stuff that we don't necessarily know or need to know, right? But it's kind of generally helping the stuff that's built on top. Yeah.
Rene, thanks so much for sharing this with us today. Take care, man.
Thank you.
Bye.